back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of Reconstruction, the years following the Civil War. In the previous lecture, we talked about presidential Reconstruction and the plans of Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. In this lecture, we're going to continue forward talking about Congressional Reconstruction and the plan adopted by Congress that ultimately did oversee and serve as the law of the land during that era. In the previous lecture, I mentioned that a number of southern states began moving forward under Andrew Johnson's plan for Reconstruction, passing new state constitutions and working through the process of reapplying for admittance back to the Union. Many of those states began to incorporate into their new constitutions laws that came to be known as black codes. These were laws governing the freed slaves, and we see many instances of those laws that were extremely restrictive and, as much as possible, attempted to recreate the kind of relationship they had under slavery, that is, blacks completely subservient and whites dominant. So there are a number of examples that I can share, although bear in mind these are state laws. There were dozens and dozens of different ones through many different states. But as some examples, freedmen were not allowed to testify versus whites in the court of law. There were all manner of vagrancy laws designed to keep blacks on the plantations, curfews, and so on. In many states, blacks could be whipped as punishment for crimes, of course, whipping one of the most heinous legacies of slavery. In some states, blacks were called servant and whites were called master, and so on. There were many, many variations on these laws. So why do we see these implemented? Well, again, bear in mind, these are Southern legislatures left to their own devices under Johnson's plan. So obviously, one of their intentions is to maintain control. In some ways, this was a way of thumbing their nose at the federal government. You want us to recognize the freed slaves? We're not going to do that. They also feared black retaliation, and we've talked extensively in this course about fear of slave rebellions and so on, really throughout history. This was the ultimate slave rebellion. The slaves are all freed, and so whites feared that they were going to retaliate. They were also worried about maintaining their labor supply. Without the slaves, who's going to do all of the work that needed to be done? And of course, underpinning all of this is simple racism. Southern whites believed that they were superior to blacks, and blacks should be forced to stay in that inferior position. The Northern response to black codes is to further resent the South and want to enforce stronger measures. And so the North began to lean towards more radical measures, which we'll be talking about shortly. In the meantime, several events in 1866 caused Northerners to become even more opposed to Johnson. One of them was the Memphis riot, beginning on May 2nd in Memphis. Blacks had assembled there to discuss some of their plans during this process of Reconstruction. Police gathered around the scene. Nobody really knows how exactly things started, but there was some pushing and shoving around the fringes. Eventually, shots are fired, and all hell broke loose. Over 2 days of rioting, 44 blacks were killed, 5 black women raped, 90 black houses burned, and 12 black schools burned. The Memphis riot was only the worst of that summer. There were other riots in other cities and violence breaking out around much of the country. There was a major riot in New Orleans later that summer. And so Northerners are becoming aware that the South really can't govern itself under these kind of situations. Greater oversight was going to be needed. There were also disputes between Andrew Johnson and Congress over a number of issues. The Freedmen's Bureau, which was created in 1865 to assist freedmen in their adjustment to freedom. And we're going to talk much more about the Freedmen's Bureau in future lectures. But in 1866, it came up for renewal, and while Congress passed the measure, Johnson vetoed it. He also vetoed a civil rights bill, which Congress had passed in hopes of helping ensure the freedom of blacks against the black codes. Both measures were passed over Johnson's veto. Also in 1866, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which they believed would offer stronger protection for the freedmen against the kind of racism that we see implemented in the black codes. The 14th Amendment is a sweeping amendment with many long-lasting and important results, which we would discuss in a future course. Its key element for our purposes here stated that citizens of all races, born or naturalized in the United States, would be eligible for citizenship, and this is most pointedly directed at the freedmen. Andrew Johnson responded to the 14th Amendment with racist vigor. He went on a speaking tour around the country. Recall that amendments need to be validated by states around the country. And so he went on a speaking tour leading up to the midterm elections of 1866. This speaking tour came to be known as the Swing Around the Circle, and it was a disaster for Andrew Johnson. In hindsight, he should never have gone. He was a disgrace. His speeches were rambling, aimless rants against Northern Republicans. The press nicknamed this Adventures in Blunderland, and he was called the Drunken Tailor, for he often appeared for these speeches drunk. In the aftermath of the Swing Around the Circle, the Democrats lost a disastrous election, and Republicans achieved a two-thirds majority in both houses, enough to override Johnson's presidential vetoes. So in general, Andrew Johnson had sided with the South on every major Reconstruction issue, and had proven himself to be utterly biased against blacks. He impeded congressional measures as much as he was able by repeatedly vetoing bills, and by the 1866 elections, Congress, particularly Northern congressmen, were fed up. So after those midterm elections of 1866, with Republicans holding heavy majorities in both houses of Congress, we enter the next period of Reconstruction, which is known as Congressional Reconstruction. It's sometimes called Radical Reconstruction for reasons I'll discuss in just a moment. So Republicans hold majorities in both houses of Congress, but they were swayed considerably by a relative minority in both houses of Congress known as Radical Republicans. They were never a majority in either house, but their views represented some of the radical goals for Reconstruction. Who were some of these radicals? Well, Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania was one of the most prominent and outspoken. Club-footed, awkward in appearance, it seemed his wig was never on straight. He actually lived with his mulatto housekeeper, and his abiding passion was equality. Stevens had a keen mind, a vicious tongue, and was a dreaded opponent in debate. Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, whom some of you might recall, he was the one who was beaten by Preston Brooks in the Brooks-Sumner affair back prior to the Civil War. Well, in the aftermath of the war, he returned to his seat in the Senate and became one of the most outspoken advocates for the freed slaves. What were the goals of these radical Republicans? Well, they all insisted on equality for blacks and on a harsh plan imposed on the South. They also supported full citizenship for the freedmen. They were convinced that only the Republican Party could do it, but they would also need at least some conservative support, and so they could not necessarily expect support for their most extreme proposals. Some of those extreme views were proposed by Thaddeus Stevens in what is known as the Stevens Plan. He proposed that Southerners be stripped of their citizenship, white Southerners, former Confederates, and that their land be confiscated and distributed among the freedmen. Ultimately, those kinds of extreme proposals were not adopted, but it gives you a sense of how far some of the radicals wanted to go with Reconstruction, stripping white Southerners of citizenship, taking their land, and giving it to the freed slaves. These were extreme views. The plan adopted by Congress in March of 1867 was a little bit more moderate than those proposed by Stevens and some of the radicals. So here are some of the essential elements of the Congressional Reconstruction Act of 1867. The 10 unreconstructed southern states were divided into 5 military districts, which you see on this map. The military would be authorized to make arrests and hold trials in the South. Bearing in mind, remember that the black codes didn't allow blacks to testify against whites in court. Now they could, at least under this plan. The military would direct agencies for making the new constitutions. In other words, they would oversee the process of making the new Southern constitutions. And so we don't see the most radical and extreme views adopted. You don't have the confiscation of Southern lands or massive disenfranchisement of whites. So this plan is not extremely radical in its nature. But this is the plan that's going to govern Reconstruction and the process of readmitting Southern states, which we'll be discussing over the next few lectures.